It is a cold December afternoon in 2006 inside the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, and the museum's director is standing alone in front of the most famous face in the ancient world, adjusting the lighting on a display case for what should be a routine inspection. Nothing about this moment is supposed to matter. Then he freezes. Under the new angle of light, he can suddenly see faint wrinkles on the neck of the sculpture and small signs of aging around the eyes that nobody has documented before in over 80 years of public display. He knows this bust better than almost anyone alive, and he has never once seen those lines described in any record or restoration report. Something is wrong, or something has been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Within months, this single observation sets off a full hospital-grade CT scan of the sculpture, the same kind of machine doctors use to search for tumors and fractures inside the human body. And what comes back on the screen in Thutmose 7 stuns even the scientists running the machine. There's a second face carved inside the first one. Not a rough support core, not a random block of stone. A complete, fully detailed second portrait, hidden inside the most recognizable face from all of ancient Egypt for more than 3,000 years. And somebody made the deliberate choice to bury it there on purpose. Stay with me to the end of this video, because the full story is far stranger than anything I could summarize in a single sentence. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe before we get started. Let's talk about the object itself first, because you need to understand exactly what makes it so special before the hidden face inside it makes any sense at all. This is the bust of Nefertiti, Queen of Egypt and wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled during the 14th century BC. She is remembered as one of the most powerful women in the entire history of ancient Egypt, closely tied to one of the strangest and most controversial periods the civilization ever went through. Her husband tried to abandon Egypt's traditional gods entirely and forced the whole country to worship a single sun disk called the Aten. This was not a small policy shift. Akhenaten shut down temples that had operated continuously for centuries, relocated Egypt's entire royal capital to a brand new city built from nothing in the middle of the desert, and rewrote the artistic rules that had governed Egyptian sculpture and painting for well over 1,000 years. Nefertiti stood right beside him through every part of it. In several surviving temple carvings from this period, she is even shown performing religious rituals, traditionally reserved only for the pharaoh himself, which tells historians she very likely held real political and religious authority of her own, not just a ceremonial title handed to her by marriage. The bust that carries her name has been called the most beautiful face to survive from the entire ancient world, and it is not hard to see why. The long, elegant neck, the tall blue crown, the high cheekbones, the faint, knowing smile. It looks almost too perfect to be real. And it turns out that is exactly the point. The story of how this bust came out of the ground begins on December 6, 1912. A German archaeological team led by an Egyptologist named Ludwig Borchardt was digging through the ruins of an ancient city called Amarna, built entirely from scratch by Akhenaten to serve as the new capital of his religious revolution. Inside those ruins, Borchardt's team had been focusing on one particular building, a workshop that clearly belonged to a master sculptor named Thutmose. This is not a guess. Thutmose's own name was found carved into an ivory item recovered from the exact same site, which is how historians know with certainty whose workshop this actually was. Inside, the archaeologists found the ordinary chaos of an active artist's studio. Unfinished statues, broken plaster molds, scattered tools, and practice pieces frozen at every stage of completion. And then, buried beneath sand and centuries of debris, they found her. The bust of Nefertiti, sitting quietly in the exact spot where it had originally been created. That detail matters far more than most people realize. This sculpture was not pulled from a royal tomb, a temple, or a palace. It came out of a working artist's studio, which tells us this piece likely never reached whatever official destination it was originally meant for. Maybe it was intended as an official royal portrait. Maybe it was a teaching model used to train Thutmose's apprentices. Maybe it was simply an experimental piece the sculptor was still refining when everything changed. Whatever the true answer is, the bust appears to have spent its entire existence sitting right there in that one workshop. When Akhenaten died, and his religious reforms collapsed almost immediately afterward, the city of Amarna was abandoned in a hurry. Workshops were left exactly as they stood, buildings sealed shut and left to the sand, and Nefertiti's bust sat in total darkness, untouched, for roughly 3,300 years. The other objects recovered from that same workshop give us a genuine clue about how this bust was likely constructed. Archaeologists pulled several plaster face casts out of Thutmose's studio, and many appear to have been taken directly from the faces of real, living people. Unlike the stiff, idealized style you would normally expect from royal Egyptian art, these casts show authentic human detail, small asymmetries, real skin texture, the kind of natural imperfection you would expect from an actual living face rather than an artistic ideal, which raises an obvious question. If Thutmose regularly worked from lifelike face casts for his other commissions, Is it possible the hidden inner layer of the Nefertiti bust was built using that exact same method? Could that buried inner face actually be the closest thing we have to what the real queen truly looked like? Even Borchardt himself seemed genuinely stunned by what his team had uncovered. In his personal diary entry from the day of the discovery, he wrote that mere words could not properly describe it, that it was something a person simply had to witness with their own eyes in order to understand. What happened after the discovery turned into one of the longest-running disputes in the entire history of archaeology, and it remains unresolved to this day. Egyptian authorities have argued for decades that Borchardt deliberately downplayed the true importance of the bust during the official division of artifacts, describing the piece using vague, unimpressive language instead of properly identifying it as an exceptional museum-defining masterpiece, so Egyptian officials never grasped its true value at the time. German authorities have always firmly rejected this version of events, insisting the entire process followed the legal rules standard for that era. More than 100 years later, neither side has budged, and the bust remains in Berlin while Egypt continues to formally request its return. This is not just a minor historical footnote. It sits at the center of a much larger, ongoing global conversation about where ancient artifacts truly belong, echoing similar arguments made over the Elgin marbles sitting in London instead of Athens. Supporters of keeping the bust in Berlin argue its presence there has allowed millions more people to see it than would ever have been possible in a smaller regional collection. Critics respond that popularity was never the actual legal or moral question, and that an object removed under murky, disputed circumstances does not become rightfully owned simply because enough time has passed. But the political fight over ownership is only one layer of this story, and honestly, it is not even the most fascinating part. Long before the famous 2007 scan, researchers had already tried once before to look inside the sculpture. Back in 1992, an earlier CT scan revealed that the bust had a surprisingly complicated internal structure, more complex than a simple stone support core should ever be. But the scanning technology available in the early 1990s was not sensitive enough to explain what researchers were seeing. That first scanner could only produce a cross-sectional image roughly every 5 millimeters, which sounds precise, until you realize the detail everyone was missing turned out to be sitting just 1 or 2 millimeters beneath the surface. Scientists knew something unusual was down there. They simply could not tell whether it was a rough support block or something far more deliberate. Everything changed in the mid-2000s when Dietrich Wildung, who directed Berlin's Egyptian Museum at the time, was adjusting the display lighting one afternoon in 2006 and noticed those faint wrinkles and subtle signs of aging that nobody had ever paid close attention to before. That single observation became the spark. It led directly to a full CT scan led by Dr. Alexander Huppertz, director of Berlin's Imaging Science Institute at Charité Hospital, using a modern 64-slice spiral CT scanner, the exact type of machine hospitals use today to study tumors, blood vessels, and the delicate structures inside the human brain. For the very first time, researchers could examine the interior of this 3,000-year-old sculpture with genuine medical precision. And as the three-dimensional images built up layer by layer on the monitor, the team realized they were looking at something absolutely nobody had expected to find. It helps to understand exactly how a sculpture like this one was physically constructed, because that is precisely what makes the scan results so meaningful. Thutmose worked using a two-stage process, common for high-status portraiture during this period. First, he carved a solid core directly out of limestone, shaping the basic structure of the face, skull, and neck. Then, on top of that stone foundation, he applied multiple layers of stucco, a plaster-like material made from gypsum, which could be smoothed and refined in ways raw limestone simply could not allow. This gave sculptors enormous creative control, letting them rough out the underlying structure in solid stone, then adjust the outer stucco layer separately, without ever needing to recarve the stone underneath. It is a bit like a modern sculptor building an armature first, and then applying clay on top of it. Except here, the hidden internal layer was not just a rough support structure, it was already a complete, detailed portrait in its own right, finished with the same care as the surface everyone was meant to see. That is precisely what nobody expected the CT scan to reveal, and it is exactly why the discovery caught even experienced Egyptologists off guard. The limestone core was a complete, carefully carved sculpture in its own right, every feature shaped with the same skill as the famous face on the outside. This was not an abandoned rough draft. It was a finished portrait, deliberately hidden underneath a second, entirely different portrait. And here is where the story gets genuinely strange. When researchers compared the hidden inner face to the one the entire world already knows, the two were not identical, and the differences were too specific, too consistent, to be explained away as random chance or simple erosion over 3,000 years. They looked deliberate, as though someone had made a conscious decision to change one face into another. The hidden limestone face has faint creases at the corners of the mouth, subtle lines suggesting either age or natural expression. Those exact lines are completely absent on the outer face, smoothed away entirely by the stucco layer applied on top. The nose tells a similar story. Underneath, the limestone carving shows a small bump along the bridge, a very natural human detail. On the surface, everyone sees today that bump has vanished, replaced with a perfectly straight, refined line. Even the cheekbones were adjusted and reshaped on the outer layer to appear noticeably higher and sharper than what the stone underneath actually shows. And the CT scans revealed something else, too. The stucco coating covering the limestone core is not evenly applied. It is thicker in some spots and thinner in others, which tells researchers this was not a simple, uniform coat of plaster. The artist was actively reshaping specific individual features on purpose, one at a time, with real intention behind every choice. Dr. Huppertz, who led the scanning team, described the discovery simply, saying the sculpture essentially contains two slightly different faces, and that studying these hidden layers gave researchers genuinely valuable insight into exactly how the piece was constructed more than 3,000 years ago. Egyptologists who reviewed the findings offered a fairly grounded explanation. In this view, Thutmose likely carved a realistic portrait into the limestone first, capturing natural features and perhaps genuine signs of aging. Then, working in stucco on top of that stone core, he refined specific details, smoothing wrinkles, straightening the nose, and lifting the cheekbones to bring the final image closer to the artistic beauty standards of the period. If that explanation is correct, then the famous face the entire world recognizes is not really a straightforward portrait at all. It is a refined, polished version of one. And that raises a genuinely bigger question, because the era Nefertiti lived through, known today as the Amarna period, spanning roughly between 1353 and 1336 BC, is actually famous among historians for moving toward greater realism in art, not away from it. Compared to the rigid, formal artistic style Egypt had followed for centuries beforehand, Amarna art feels surprisingly human and intimate. Royal family members are shown hugging each other and playing, things almost never depicted in earlier Egyptian royal art. Akhenaten himself is famously depicted with an unusually elongated face and narrow body, features historians still argue about today, some believing it was deliberate religious symbolism, others thinking it reflects his actual appearance. Either way, the entire artistic movement of this era leaned strongly towards showing genuine human detail instead of hiding it, which is exactly what makes the Nefertiti bust so unusual. In some ways, it is one of the most lifelike sculptures the period ever produced. In other ways, it is also one of the most idealized objects Egypt ever created. The outer face is almost impossibly smooth and symmetrical, closer to an abstract ideal than to any real human face. But the hidden face buried underneath, with its small lines and imperfections, feels much closer to the humanized spirit that defined Amarna art in the first place. So here is the real mystery sitting at the center of all this. Why would a master sculptor carve a realistic, detailed portrait first, and then deliberately cover it up with a second, more perfect version? One simple explanation is that this was just standard studio practice for the time. An ordinary adjustment meant to match accepted beauty standards. Nothing more dramatic than that. But not everyone stops there. Since the scan results were published, some historians have floated a much bolder idea that the hidden limestone face might actually be closer to how Nefertiti truly looked as she aged, and that her natural features were quietly softened and idealized before ever being shown to the public. If that theory holds up, this bust might represent one of the oldest known examples of a ruler's public image being deliberately managed and enhanced, thousands of years before anything resembling a modern photograph ever existed. The journey this sculpture went on after it left the ground is almost as wild as the mystery hiding inside it. After arriving in Berlin in 1913, the bust stayed out of public view for years. It was not until 1924 that Berlin finally put it on display, and the reaction was immediate. One publication called it the most lifelike object ever recovered from ancient Egypt. When the Second World War brought heavy bombing across German cities, Nefertiti ended up hidden inside a salt mine in Thuringia for the remainder of the war. After Germany's defeat, the bust stayed on display in West Berlin throughout the Cold War, while related artifacts sat separated in East Berlin behind the wall running through the city. Today, the bust holds a place of honor inside Berlin's Neues Museum, arguably the most famous artifact in the entire country. And through every part of that journey, Egypt has never stopped asking for it back. In 2003, prominent Egyptologist Zahi Hawass formally requested that Germany return the bust. Germany said no. Hawass renewed the request in 2011, and the answer stayed exactly the same. So today, hundreds of thousands of visitors walk past the bust every year, admiring that flawless exterior, almost none of them realizing there is a second face hiding directly underneath it, one that looks slightly older, slightly less perfect, and possibly closer to the real woman who actually lived more than 3,300 years ago. Since the scan results were made public, Scholars have kept arguing about what those two hidden faces really mean, and the conversation has quietly turned into a surprisingly modern question. Was Nefertiti's public image being carefully managed the exact same way a modern public figure's image gets managed today? A number of historians genuinely believe exactly that, pointing out that royal Egyptian art was never meant to function as a straightforward, honest portrait. Images of pharaohs and queens existed to project power, beauty, and divine status. Literal accuracy was often the least important part of the job. Seen through that lens, the outer face stops looking like just a sculpture and starts looking like a political tool. The hidden limestone layer represents the real woman underneath, while the polished exterior represents the image the royal court chose to present. But not everyone agrees. Other researchers argue the differences might simply be too subtle to support deliberate image control, and could just be the natural result of switching between two very different materials, since limestone naturally produces a slightly textured surface, while stucco allows much smoother contours. Under this reading, Thutmose was not crafting propaganda at all. He was simply completing a piece of art the way any skilled sculptor of his era naturally would have. Whichever explanation you personally choose to believe, this discovery drags up a much bigger question that historians still cannot fully answer. How much do we genuinely know about Nefertiti as an actual living person? The honest answer is surprisingly little. There is no diary, no personal letters written in her own hand have ever turned up. No first-hand written account describing her personality or daily life has survived anywhere in the historical record. Almost everything we think we know about her comes filtered through images, statues, temple carvings, and official royal artwork. And out of every image that survives from her lifetime, none has shaped the modern world's idea of Nefertiti more than this one bust. For more than 100 years, it has quietly defined how the entire world pictures her. But if the outer face really was intentionally refined and altered from the honest portrait carved underneath it, then the exact image that became her global identity might also be the version least faithful to how she truly looked in real life. The wider artistic style of the Amarna period only adds another layer to this puzzle. Official artwork from Akhenaten's reign frequently shows the royal family with distinctive, exaggerated features, elongated skulls and sharply defined structures repeating across temple reliefs. Yet the famous outer face of the Nefertiti bust does not really follow that exaggerated pattern at all. It presents a more balanced, conventionally attractive image, one that lines up remarkably well with modern ideas of beauty even today. So did the final stucco adjustments deliberately steer the portrait away from typical Amarna style and toward something more universally appealing? Nobody can say for certain, and that lingering uncertainty is a huge part of why this story remains so compelling more than a century after the bust was first pulled from the desert sand. After years of scanning, study, and heated academic argument, we're left holding a strange contradiction. In one sense, we probably know more physical detail about this single face than almost any other face to survive from the ancient world. Researchers have mapped its internal layers, tested its ancient pigments, and traced the thickness of paint down to fractions of a millimeter in certain spots. And yet, with all of that precision, we still cannot say with real confidence what Nefertiti actually looked like, because the face the entire world instantly recognizes is not the face that was originally carved. And the face that was originally carved stayed completely hidden from human eyes for well over 3,000 years. There is actually a third way to look at this mystery, one that skips past the argument between propaganda and honest imperfection altogether. Maybe the two faces were never competing versions at all, but simply two stages of a single, ongoing piece of art, the limestone a structural foundation Thutmose built on top of, before applying stucco to refine the piece. The hidden face was never meant to be viewed on its own. If history had gone even slightly differently, nobody alive today would ever have known that inner face existed at all. But fate had other plans. First, a German archaeologist packed the piece into a wooden shipping crate back in 1912. Then, decades later, a doctor slid it into a modern CT scanner and exposed something that had stayed invisible for over 3,000 years. So what has actually changed since those scan results were first made public? We now know for certain that this sculpture is not a single, simple object. It is a layered construction, a carefully carved limestone core wrapped entirely in carefully applied stucco. We know a complete second portrait exists, hidden underneath the famous surface everyone instantly recognizes, a fully realized face carrying deliberate, specific differences from the one currently on public display. And we know that the sculptor, almost certainly Thutmose himself, intentionally reshaped particular features between that inner version and the outer one presented to the world. That single intentional choice might be the most fascinating detail buried anywhere in this entire story. It turns a 3,000-year-old sculpture into something that feels startlingly modern. A reminder that the gap between how someone actually looks and how they choose to be seen by the rest of the world is not a new problem at all. It might be one of the oldest problems there is. Think about how strange that really is. We live in an era obsessed with the idea that photographs and edited images can quietly reshape how a person is remembered. And we treat that as a distinctly modern anxiety unique to smartphones and social media. But 3,300 years ago, a royal sculptor working inside a mud brick studio in the Egyptian desert was apparently doing something remarkably similar. Carving one honest version of a queen's face, then deliberately building a second, more idealized version on top of it for the world to see instead. The tools were completely different, limestone and gypsum instead of pixels and editing software, but the underlying instinct that a polished, perfected image should be the one presented to the public seems to be exactly the same. It also changes how you should look at every other flawless-looking statue, painting, or carved royal portrait you have ever seen from the ancient world. If a queen, as heavily documented and intensely studied as Nefertiti, could carry a hidden, unrefined version of her own face for over 3,000 years, without a single person knowing how many other ancient portraits are quietly doing the exact same thing right now, sitting inside museums around the world, never having been scanned closely enough to reveal it? Most ancient sculptures have never been examined with anything close to the precision Huppert's and his team used on this piece back in 2007, which means the Nefertiti bust might not be a rare exception at all. It might simply be the very first one we happen to catch. If this video pulled you into something you had never really thought about before, that is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to dig up. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing history explained this way, because there are plenty of hidden discoveries just like this one still waiting to be uncovered. Drop a comment and tell me honestly, do you think the hidden face is the real Nefertiti, or do you think this was simply how ancient sculptors normally finished their work back then? I genuinely want to hear which side you land on. On the next episode, we are heading to a 9,000-year-old site in Turkey that archaeologists have just reopened, and what they found carved into the stone there has left experts struggling to come up with an explanation. Subscribe now so you do not miss it.